KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger, a public affairs program featuring stories from all over the Central Valley with Sevag Tateosian, 90.7 KFSR.
Welcome to another edition of the Central Valley Ledger. We're recording out of the beautiful downtown Fresno studios of the Community Media Access Collaborative, Fresno and Clovis. Our guest is joining us via telephone. His name is Dr. Dean Foreman. He's the chief economist for an organization called the American Petroleum Institute. Dr. Foreman, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
Dr. Foreman, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into talking about the Petroleum Institute.
Glad to. A PhD economist from the University of Florida. Worked actually in the telecom industry for 7 years doing regulatory policy and forecasting before then joining ExxonMobil as the lead economist in their corporate planning group. And I've spent, a total of almost 20 years in industry between corporate strategic planning, finance, treasury, and risk management.
Over the course of your 20-year career, I'm sure you've seen some very interesting things. Tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this line of work.
Well, I'm passionate about energy economics because it really speaks to the connections between local and global communities and the things that are both intellectually interesting but also really important. So think of it this way. In energy, here you have an industry that's technologies, it's important to the environment, it's international, it has complex market structures. So in addition to that, it has a tremendous amount of data. So the skill set in economics, statistical measurement, modeling, simulations, all of these can tell us things that are really important for policies in the real world, and I love that.
There are times where we can create policies that will impact people in their pocketbooks, correct?
Most definitely, yes.
So tell us a little bit about the American Petroleum Institute.
So next year will mark the 100th anniversary of the American Petroleum Institute, or API. And at its heart, API is the standard-setting organization for the natural gas and oil industry. So we promote safety across the industry globally and also influence public policy in support of strong, viable U.S. natural gas and oil. We're the only national trade association that represents all parts, all segments of the natural gas and oil industry, including more than 600 member companies, supporting some 10.3 million jobs across the United States.
Our economy relies heavily on petroleum, correct, and natural gas?
It does, but not just in the ways that many people think about. So if you were looking at a segment of the economy just as a percentage, you'd say, well, it's less than 10% of total economic value. But it has threads that enable economic growth across so many different sectors. And for example, every material, if you like camping materials or your shoes or eyeglasses or all the way down to a cell phone, if you're looking at the plastics and the materials that are in it, whether it's the energy used to create it or the material itself, every cell phone is in of itself roughly half made of natural gas and oil in some way, shape, or form. So the materials, the energy that moves things, and all of these things that enable our economic growth, that's what's important about it.
So you mentioned some things now that people don't really associate with energy. Do you think the public as a general, we don't understand the significance of energy?
I think it varies. I think there are people who do, and then there are things that we naturally as human beings take for granted. And a lot of the things that are in our daily lives, the materials in particular, one of the biggest questions that often comes when we start looking at, well, how does society use energy and how might it use it in the future? The notion of materials and the importance of those, people often look past and they say, well, surely we should see greater efficiencies in the industrial use of energy. And you're like, well, a lot of that actually is embedded. It's not burnable carbon. It's actually embedded in the things that everybody wants, not just in the United States, but globally.
So you've had a very interesting 20-year career. Tell us about some things that in your experience, in your career, you have noticed impact our economy in a negative way.
Well, the key things right now, and the one that's really making the headlines, it's U.S. international trade and trade relations across the full spectrum. And there are really kind of three layers to this. You can think of the headline today, the announcement from the Trump administration that there's a prospective deal for a U.S.-Mexico trade agreement or renewal or replacement of the North American Free Trade Agreement. This has the potential also to include Canada soon. So the alternative here is a scrapping of the North American Free Trade Agreement that would have tremendous negative implications, not only for energy, but all industries that rely on cross-border trade in North America. So API is encouraged that negotiators have reached a preliminary agreement to modernize their trade relationships. Now, a second layer of this, though, and a part that's a bit more concerning, is the tariffs being imposed on U.S. imports of steel and aluminum. This is having many unintended consequences. There's a very convoluted process by the U.S. Trade Representative to try to have exemptions to it. That's not been working so well. And then the third component are the tariffs being imposed on U.S. Imports of goods from China, and also the tariffs, the escalating trade war where China is also imposing tariffs on U.S. exports. But those last two components are raising price inflation in the United States, and consumers are going to feel that in their pocketbook, and already are.
You are talking about something that's very, very current, and I'm glad that we're going down this path. So a lot of people may not understand what NAFTA is. We hear about it in the news all the time, whether it's local news, whether it's our newspapers, whether it's national news. NAFTA really impacts us in the pocketbooks, correct? What is NAFTA?
So the North American Free Trade Agreement, as it was implemented back in 1995, basically gets rid of tariffs for goods that flow across the value chain from Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. It also has enabled there are no tariffs on energy, for example. It's able to flow back and forth. And if you think about the way our industry is structured, we might take crude oil from Mexico or Canada, upgrade it make it into a product like gasoline or diesel, and ship it back to Mexico or Canada for sale, and vice versa. There are examples where they may take a crude from the United States and ship something back, and vice versa. This works in the petrochemical industry, it works in the refining industry, and all the way down to the automotive industry. If you think about the value chain and the different parts of things that are assembled in different pieces, and then value is added, and often the parts go back and forth. So NAFTA enables that trade. It enables a complex supply chain where businesses have made big investments, tens of billions of dollars, on the back of understanding how they can trade these things. So suddenly, if it grinds to a halt and you start getting these roadblocks with big percentage tariffs put in the middle, or the inability, perhaps, to flow goods back and forth across the border freely, that has big implications for businesses and their ability to execute and deliver results that both investors and consumers have expected.
You are listening to the Central Valley Ledger on KFSR 90.7 FM. You're also watching this broadcast on the CMAC channels, Comcast 93 and AT&T 99. Our guest is Dr. Dean Foreman. He's the chief economist of an organization called the American Petroleum Institute. Dr. Foreman, thank you for joining us again.
Very glad to be on. Thank you.
We're going to pause and listen to some local music from a local person named Brian Turner. When we come back, we'll talk to Dr. Foreman some more about the topics impacting our economy.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I hear the tremble of quantum strings. tremble of quantum strings.
Welcome back. Our guest is Dr. Dean Foreman. Dr. Foreman, can you tell us a little bit about, like, we hear in the media that China may impose tariffs on us and other countries may impose tariffs on us. Putting all politics aside, does this impact people like you and me in the pocketbook?
Most definitely. When we look at just the trace of price inflation so far this year, as of June, it had risen to 2.8% year over year. So that's a sudden rise actually from closer to 2% earlier in the year. And a lot of this is the tariffs kicking in, the rising both energy costs, but steel costs, everything related to it is starting to ebb and flow into the consumer prices that we're seeing every day.
Let me ask you about some things that have impacted our economy in a positive way. We've talked about the negative, and we're really concerned about the negative because most of us have a tight budget, and if things start going up a little bit, it's going to impact us and our families. Talk about some positive things that you have seen in your career that have helped the economy.
Well, by far the biggest thing, and this is a once-in-generation kind of development, has been the U.S. energy renaissance, as we call it. So we've seen, starting with American innovation and technology, a fundamental shift in the U.S. energy security and the ability to produce natural gas and oil. And this has flown through certain state economies, but also nationwide. It's producing benefits that we've gone from being at the behest of whatever the whims are of the international crude oil market to being able to produce so much domestically that we're now within an eyesight of a few years of being able to be a net exporter of oil. And this is the first year where we're actually a net exporter of natural gas. So the U.S. is producing some 10.7 million barrels per day of crude oil, another 4.4 million barrels per day of what are called natural gas liquids. So these are other liquids that come by virtue of natural gas production. And together, this year, the U.S. has supplied basically all of its own demand growth, plus that of the entire world. It has more than compensated for production losses among OPEC nations. So this is activity, economic activity, starting in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, North Dakota. It flows through. And even California, where you have substantial oil production, this has been benefiting the U.S. economy as a whole, U.S. consumers, and U.S. consumers are continuing to get a discount compared with international oil prices by virtue of having this strong industry at home.
So what you're saying is, usually when we think of oil-producing nations, we think of countries in the Middle East. But what you're saying is we actually have that capability to not only produce, but also have enough so that we may be self-sufficient?
We've become self-sufficient already in natural gas, and we are within 3 million barrels per day of being self-sufficient in oil as well. So the Trump administration has the vision of U.S. energy dominance, and we're well on our way there. The next step of this, by the way, is a manufacturing renaissance on top of having this abundant and affordable source of energy. And we've seen so much investment going into the manufacturing sector and the petrochemical sector. These were energy-intensive industries that were effectively eviscerated over the last couple of decades. In just the last 5 years, we've seen a renaissance in the investment coming back in, and hence the jobs and the productivity. Now we need the ability to trade it for the things that we were talking about earlier. But it really is a structural change for the U.S. economy.
Very interesting. Dr. Foreman, I have small kids. I have our family is growing, and so little things impact me, and I'm very careful of that. Can you talk about gas prices and our home energy bills?
Yeah, glad to. So the first thing to know about gasoline prices and diesel fuel as well is that they very closely track the price of crude oil. And they do so because crude oil is the number one factor that goes into making gasoline or diesel. So by the U.S. Energy Information Administration's estimates, as of this last month or two, they'd say that crude oil makes up 56, 57% of the price of motor gasoline. Now, what that means then is that you're looking at big global market for setting a lot of those prices. But at the same time, when it comes to the home energy bills, how homes use energy depends a lot on electricity prices, which in turn has increasingly relied on natural gas, which has been coming down over time. So when we net put the pieces together, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does what's called a consumer expenditure survey. This is consumer expenditure data that go into the creation of the consumer price index. And their latest data would show that all home energy together represents about 6.6% of a household's total spending. So that's all energy, including electricity, heating fuels, and motor fuels. And that's a decade low. That's the lowest amount that households have spent on energy in a decade.
So we're broadcasting in Fresno County, central of California. For a county like Fresno, where there are economic challenges, are the impacts greater?
Well, let's be frank that California as a state has some of the highest taxes that are placed on motor fuels in the entire nation. So to the extent that you have communities where you have greater either lower income absolute level as well as a higher disparity in income across households, the importance of the price of motor fuels, it can have an impact. There's no question about it. So the sensitivity to that, right now, fortunately, the economy is strong. We're seeing strong employment conditions, and we're seeing energy prices that are still very low relative to historical standards. So that helps, but it also, if the tide turns, does have the potential to have an impact.
Dr. Foreman, I want to ask you a more personal question. Tell us a little bit about what your day looks like, because I imagine someone like you keep up with the economy, you keep up with politics. Am I right? I mean, in talking to you, I get the impression that you've got a good grasp of what's going on around you.
Thank you very much. No, the days vary, but each quarter we do what's called an API industry outlook. So I'm surveying globally everything that's happening in the economy, in oil markets, natural gas markets, as well as petrochemical markets, and putting that together into a story of things that matter right now and how the trends are playing out. Another thing that I look at is API executes a survey of about 85% of the industry every month, and we put out on a weekly basis inventory reports, but there's a lot of other interesting data to mine in there about the supply and demand and the trade of everything from gasoline and diesel fuel to jet fuel, each of the refined products, plus the raw products like crude oil and natural gas liquids like we were talking about before. So we put together a monthly statistical report. In fact, both of these work products, the monthly statistical report, which has a lot of it's concise. It'll tell you very clearly what's happening, but also has a lot of nice data points, as well as the graphical presentation of this industry outlook. Spent a lot of time packaging that, and those are available on API's website at www.api.org. So from that main page, there's a chief economist section. We present those materials. In addition to that, I do a lot of speaking engagements and a lot of advocacy out at the state level where these issues are coming up.
You are listening to 90.7 KFSR Fresno, and you're watching this broadcast on Comcast 93 and AT&T 99, the CMAC channels. Let's pause and listen to a brief musical entry by a local, Brian Turner, and then we'll come back and wrap up the program with Dr. Dean Foreman, who's talking to us a little bit about energy, a little bit about gas, and other things that impact the economy. Welcome back, Dr. Foreman. Thanks again for joining us this week on the Central Valley Ledger.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Before we wrap up the show, tell us a little bit about how our audience members can be engaged or be involved in what it is you do at the American Petroleum Institute. If we continue to monitor your website or review your website, are we going to learn about some of the things you're involved in?
Very much. So these work products that I mentioned, the monthly statistical report and the API, our quarterly industry outlook, both give great information. In addition to that, we have an Energy Tomorrow website that has a blog, and this really adds a lot of color and current commentary that explains in layman's terms a lot of the issues that really matter in energy today.
And what is, for audience members that want to contact either you or your organization and learn more about what it is we're talking about here, what is the contact information of your organization?
Our website, www.api.org, and through that you can reach our communications department, or you can send messages to, well, you'll reach me indirectly, put it that way. It will get through.
Finally, Dr. Foreman, before we let you go, thank you for joining us, but how do you see the economy? Are we going in the right direction, or do we need work?
Right now, the economy is really strong. If anything, the question is this as good as it gets, or can we continue to build on the momentum that we've seen? The economy is the best it's been in a very, very long time. And it's not just the United States. Globally, we've seen a concerted upturn across all of the major regions. So this is a really good story. And we don't want to squander this opportunity. We need to build on it. And the way to do that is to make sure that we have good policies that enable trade, enable growth, and good relations going forward.
You have been listening to the Central Valley Ledger. We're recording out of the beautiful downtown Fresno studios of the Community Media Access Collaborative, Fresno and Clovis. Our guest is joining us via Skype telephone. His name is Dr. Dean Foreman. He's the chief economist for an organization called the American Petroleum Institute. Dr. Foreman, thank you so much for educating us on these interesting topics that impact our pocketbook.
Thanks for some excellent questions. I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks.
That's all for this edition of the program. We leave you with a little bit of music from Brian Turner, a local musician. He was on the program a few weeks ago. Thank you for tuning in the program this week. We hope you enjoyed the broadcast. To our audience members on KFSR 90.7 FM and to those watching on Comcast 93 and AT&T 99, we hope you learned a little bit about some things that impact our pocketbook. Tune in next week to a new edition.
KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger every Sunday morning at 11:30. For a complete program schedule, visit kfsr.org.